Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is, and good evening for everyone that is joining us in Nigeria and around the world. My name is Neka Chapu, and I am the principal at Asha Strategies and also the founder of African Public Affairs Committee. I want to welcome everyone to today's policy dialogue titled Nigerian Country of Particular Concern, Security, Human Rights, and Policy Implications. We have some great speakers today who are going to share some light perspective in this discussion to give a multidimensional purview of what's currently going on. We have convened this conversation because of the recent CPC rhetoric surrounding Nigeria, and that has caused a lot of confusion, fear, and in some cases, the narratives are oversimplifying a deeply complex situation. And so this session is meant to ground the conversation in evidence and research-based policy analysis from experts who have worked on governance and security and human rights for many years. I am honored today to be joined by Dr. Michael Wampa, who's renowned for his work on security, insurgency, and conflict in Nigeria. And then we have Dr. Carl Levin from the American University, a leading scholar in African politics and governance. And then we have Ikechukwu Ozoma, who's from the RFK Human Rights Organization, bringing a senior attorney, bringing a human rights and justice accountability lens. And so thank you everyone for joining. We are jumping right on it because of time. We only have an hour. And if you have any questions, please do email them to info@ashastrategies.com. And so I want to thank each and all of our panels speakers for joining us on such short notice. We felt that it was very important to hold this briefing and inform and educate people on what's currently going on. And so we're going to begin by grounding ourselves in what CPC actually means, how it functions in US foreign policy, and historical patterns. So Dr. Levin, we'll start with you with everything that kind of brought us to this point today of getting designated as country of particular concern. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Neka. It's really always a pleasure to work with you, and I'm really pleased to be on this panel discussion with Michael and Ike, and got to catch up with Michael while I was in the UK over the summer. And this is a really important issue that I care about a lot. And even before I had visited Nigeria and lived there and worked there, I was deeply, deeply concerned about the way the United States made decisions about the use of force. I'm going to speak from a couple of different perspectives here, and I'm going to leave some of the details and data about the killings of Christians and whether Christians are being targeted and so forth to my colleagues on the panel. What I want to talk about is, just number one, to state that the urgency around this and just refresh everybody's memory about what has been said. Number two, I want to talk about the background on the policy tools and the processes that are in place. And in making this assessment, I'm not just speaking as a professor in Washington, D.C., but I'm also speaking as someone who was working on Capitol Hill in the United States Congress as a congressional aide when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1998. I was legislative director for the most senior member of the House of Representatives. After that, if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of different scenarios and assess the risks of those scenarios. So let me just go right into it. And if we have time during Q&A, I can talk a little bit about policy options for Nigerians, especially in the diaspora, and for other proponents of human rights and peace and conflict resolution. So number one, what is the actual urgency here? On his social media account, President Trump has characterized the threat facing Christianity in Nigeria as existential. On November 1st, he also said that the government continues to allow the killing of Christians, calling Nigeria a disgraced country, and that the US would go in there, quote, guns a-blazing to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these terrible atrocities. Now, one of the things that's important about that is not just the inflammatory rhetoric. The important thing is that President Trump is blaming the Nigerian government for much of the ongoing violence. And so the speakers who follow me, I think, will help untangle that a little bit and try to bring an empirical assessment of those sorts of claims, which are, I would consider crude claims. So what are the policy tools and processes that we're talking about here? So the International Religious Freedom Act was passed, as I mentioned, in 1998. That's the bill that created an office in the State Department to track religious violations of religious freedom. It created an ambassador at large position. It also created an annual report, which is what we're talking about when we refer to Nigeria being designated as a country of particular concern, CPC. What does it mean to be a country that has received that designation by the president? It means that they are, quote, engaged in or tolerated particularly severe religious freedom violations. So tolerated, again, important, since we're talking about accusations made against the government in Nigeria, not necessarily Boko Haram or in addition to Boko Haram. What does severe means? The law understands severity to mean, quote, systematic, ongoing, and egregious. And so those are some of the terms, that's the threshold that we're thinking about here. The law also created a Commission on International Religious Freedom. I know that the Nigeria Working Group in Washington, D.C. has sometimes engaged that commission. That commission produces a separate annual report, which effectively monitors implementation of the Religious Freedom Act. The act was also strengthened in 2016 by Congressman Frank Wolf, because he wanted to make sure that when we were talking about countries of particular concern, that we're also able to consider, quote, entities of particular concern, since so many perpetrators of religious violence around the world, such as the Islamic State, were not actually countries. So they were entities or organizations. So what happens when a country is designated as a CPC, country of particular concern? The executive is required to take actions. The president is required to take actions such as diplomatic measures, public or private, the delay or cancellation of scientific and cultural exchanges. So you could think about Fulbright or other things. The denial or cancellation of working, official, or state visits. So definitely think about a whole range of visas, including official visas. Development and security assistance restrictions. Well, a tremendous amount of development assistance is already gone. I'll share some figures on that in a moment. I think some of the things we need to start thinking about are financial controls and investments. So for example, directing the Export-Import Bank or the Trade and Development Agency to cancel loan guarantees or insurance or financing for projects that may be taking place in Nigeria. And certainly, I would think of international financial institution measures. Now, these are steps that are typically implemented by the Treasury Department, in cooperation with the State Department. When we think about foreign policy, we're usually thinking about the State Department, but the Treasury Department, in particular, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, becomes really, really important here. Part of the context I want to lay out here is that this is happening in the context of the Trump administration completely decimating and eroding and decaying the annual human rights report, which has been supported on a bipartisan basis since 1977. The United States government no longer gathers data on violations of freedom of assembly. Does anybody on this call remember the End SARS movement? The United States government will no longer systematically collect data on the military shooting at peaceful protesters. 2, the United States government no longer gathers data as part of that annual human rights report on internet freedom or on how civil society organizations organize. So civil society organizations are, for example, engaged in peace building efforts to counteract religious intolerance in Nigeria. Those sorts of efforts would not be systematically documented necessarily as part of the State Department's annual human rights report. Also gone, data collection on government corruption, data collection on election abuses, and strangely enough, protection for minorities. The United States government no longer systematically collects data on that. So I don't know how I'm doing on time, but the thing that I wanted to maybe take a few minutes on are assessing some of the risks and scenarios and to think about what happens next, now that that CPC designation has gone forward. In that context, I want to talk about other kinds of threats that Trump has made, how Trump is thinking about his war powers authority, and then maybe get down to specifics.
You have 4 more minutes, Carl.
Okay, great. I guess talking fast for once served me well. So one thing I wanted to continue the context and to begin to assess the information that's relevant to scenarios and risk analysis is that last year, the U.S. Agency for International Development spent $902 million in Nigeria, including $290 million on humanitarian assistance. Now, that is assistance that effectively helps provide an exit path for those who want to leave extremist organizations, in addition to protecting civilians who have been harmed. The United States also provided $334 million for HIV assistance. So $902 million total. That money is essentially gone because USAID is gone. Another important context that I don't think we talk about enough in Washington is that for a couple of years now, the bilateral National Commission has been neglected. Nigeria has not really been meeting regularly with the United States, and I think that's partly to blame for both sides. That Nigeria is currently operating without a full ambassador in the United States. I've gotten to know the Charge d'Affaires quite well, but the Nigerian government really needs to prioritize a high-profile and well-connected diplomat who can speak with the full authority of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In terms of domestic politics here in the United States, I want to highlight that Trump's support among Christians is declining since January. Even among white evangelical Protestants in the United States, there's been a 6% drop since January. Among white non-evangelicals, barely a majority, about 51% now support Donald Trump. It's down 8%. The strongest pockets of opposition among religious figures in America are among Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics. The Atlantic Monthly, just a couple of days ago, published a devastating article talking about how Trump is losing support among Catholics. So among my Igbo friends on this call who are watching this and who are thinking about, well, maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Donald Trump is not your friend, and he thinks you live in a shithole country. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how Trump has defined threats more broadly. We can go into a little more detail about this, perhaps in the Q&A. But one thing I want to say is that many presidents, including President Obama and President Clinton, have tried to define threats to the United States in somewhat vague terms in order to give themselves some latitude. Trump has taken that much, much, much further in the context of him illegally abolishing USAID, illegally abolishing United States Institute for Peace, and ignoring congressional authority for billions of dollars of authorized money. In that context, Trump sent a confidential notice to Congress in September that declared that the United States, for example, is in a, quote, non-international armed conflict, unquote, with designated drug cartels. He defined cartels as unlawful enemy combatants and supported this classification with legal reasoning, under the laws of armed conflict. At the same time, he talked about the cartel operations, saying that they constituted a, quote, armed attack against the United States, therefore authorizing legal action against them, considering cartels as enemy combatants. He's used much the same rhetoric and, in fact, legal strategy with regard to immigration. He's described unauthorized immigrants as invading the United States, and this has been referenced not just on Truth Social, but in at least 12 executive orders and official documents. Now, what that does is that change the context of the National Guard troops that walk around in my neighborhood, and it's created a spectacularly hostile and unwelcoming environment that enables racism here at home. So I want you to think about all of these things together. Domestically, we're looking at a decline in support among Christians. We're looking at racism being mobilized against immigrants and immigrant communities. The mere act of speaking Spanish in the United States is constitutionally protected by law enforcement for racial profiling and for kicking you out of the country. And you might not be going back to El Salvador, you might be getting sent to Sudan, even if you're from El Salvador. So, and there's lots to talk about pending abuses. The War Powers Resolution, just a couple of days ago, the United States Congress, on a very narrow vote, 51 to 49, which included several Republicans who lined up with Democrats, telling us exactly how concerned people in Washington are truly becoming about President Trump's potential abuse of his war powers authority. And again, like the human rights legislation that mandates the annual human rights reports, the War Powers Resolution was not just passed on a bipartisan basis in the wake of the Vietnam War, it overrode a presidential veto. That's how concerned Congress historically has been about the presidential abuse of war powers authority. So as President Trump is targeting countries like Venezuela, as President Trump is characterizing immigration and humanitarian migration as an armed attack against the United States, we should be very, very concerned. So as we go forward and as we get additional details from Dr. Uzoma and Dr. Nwangpa, then we can talk a little bit more about the scenarios and how to anticipate them and prepare for them. And thanks so much for bringing attention to this important issue.
Thank you, Dr. Morvan, for unpacking that. I mean, I think it's important to have this type of context. And now let's shift to some realities on the ground with Dr. Nwangpa to walk us through some security dynamics and why reducing this current crisis to a single religious narrative is misleading and often dangerous. So thank you, Dr. Nwangpa. If you could take it away, please.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for the invitation. And thank you, Cal. It's good to see you again. And thank you for setting the stage for the conversation. So I've been asked to speak about the security situation, or what I would say the conflict dynamics. So I'll start off with the conflict dynamics in Nigeria. So let me start off by talking about some kind of like historical facts and say Nigeria, like many African states, is a post-colonial creation. So what that means is Nigeria is one that is arbitrarily created by former colonial states. So what that means is Nigeria has plural identities. So if we then come to Nigeria, Nigeria is I think roughly about 200 million people, 220 million people. And out of that number, nearly half of that are Christians. But when we look at conflicts, the conflict dynamics in Nigeria, barring the civil war that Nigeria had during the first few years of gaining independence, where it had a secessionist, a group of people from the Igbo tribe. I know Carl mentioned the Igbo people and cautioned about trusting Trump. That group of people tried to secede from Nigeria at the time, and then Nigeria went into this unfortunate civil war that caused the death of millions of people. But since then, what we've seen Nigeria is divided along these kind of fault lines, where you see it be religion or be it ethnicity, where again the elites have captured or mobilized or weaponized these fault lines for their own agenda. So we've seen at different stages of Nigeria's development that has manifested during the Civil War, will come during the in the 80s when the military but the military kind of suppressed a lot of these during the 80s. But since 1999, when Nigeria returned to democratic government, we've seen all of these fissures come to the surface. We've seen different groups. We saw with the Niger Delta in the south of it, in the early years of Nigeria returning to civilian rule, where you saw more economically driven and fighting against what they call environmental damage caused by multinational oil companies. So we see for a period of from 2000 to about 2009, different groups in the Niger Delta engage the Nigerian state in an act of, we wouldn't call it terrorism, because they weren't attacking the populace. They were attacking the multinational, sabotaging Nigeria's oil revenue by attacking the oil companies. So, but amnesty was granted to this group of insurgents in 2009, and then the conflict geography shifted to the northern part, where we see Boko Haram emerged in 2009. And since 2009, Boko Haram and different factions have engaged Nigeria in that conflict. Now, the difference now is, whilst in the Niger Delta we had it was more economically driven. Here, there was another mix in it was the Islamic dimension of it, where these groups wanted to bring back Sharia, and that also mixed up with the government. Also, the government of the northern government also talked about using Sharia as which was more political. So all of that intersected. But what's happened is, early on during that 2009, between 2000 and 2012, we saw heightened rhetoric from this group against Christians, where in the narrative they were anti-Christian, anti-Western, anti all of that. And early on they started attacking Christians and churches, were beat in Abuja, in Jos, and all of that. But with time, it became clear that that was more rhetoric than a deliberate strategy. It was one where they wanted to capitalize on existing tension. So let's go to the Middle Belt, where you see stuff that predated even this kind of insurgency. We see the farmer-herder conflict, which has been very, very perennial. So in this conflict, where we have the Middle Belt in Nigeria, you have where you have a significant number of Christians, be it maybe in Kaduna, for instance, where in southern Kaduna, they're largely maybe Christians. You come to the northern, where you have Muslims. And now there is a lot of complexity involved in this kind of issue, where you have largely these Christians are farmers, and you have these Muslims that are largely nomads in nature. They're pastoralists with their cattle moving around and all of that. And then again, we can throw into that mix climate change. Over the years, from the 70s, we've seen adverse climate change, or desertification, that has been affecting the movement of this group. So they've been moving into urban areas, tramping up on Christian lands or Christian farmers, and this tension has also become politicized. So if you look at that, and then we can then talk about that is more intercommunal. That mixes also with other kind of stuff. Then we see more banditry, which is criminal. So out of this group, we've seen people that have emerged from these groups that are just criminal in nature. So they've whether they kidnap for ransom, which I think again is part of redistribution of wealth, in my own opinion, kidnap for ransom. But all of this is where we see that not just the Muslims, we see that there are Christians, there are people from the South that are also involved in this grand kind of stuff. So now, if we then move on to why Trump's categorization is in my opinion, is very reckless and dangerous, because like I've said in other platforms that I've appeared on, there is no Christian genocide. There is no target and deliberate, because for you to talk about genocide, or what genocide means, whereby whether it's partly or wholly targeting a particular group or particular race or particular ethnicity or particular religion for just being what they are. And then it has to be, Carl mentioned it has to be kind of like systematic. It could be individuals, but in most cases it's always maybe from the government. But in Nigeria, we've not seen such deliberate killing. So we could also talk about that different dynamics, whether we go to the South, where you have a significant number of Muslims as well as a significant number of Christians among the Yorubas, where in a family, or most families, you can have a husband being a Muslim, a wife being a Christian, and all of that. The religion is secondary to the culture. Where you come to the North, where religion can be higher than their culture, you could see that all of this also feeds into what happens, whether be it what's going on in Gaza, whether be what's going on with the cartoon portrayal of Mohammed in France and the reaction to that. So it's always reactionary. And what we've seen over time, we've seen that there's also been retaliatory attacks from the Christian side as well, whether be it in Plateau, where the Christians have retaliated against the North, but above all of this, what we've seen, in my own opinion, the Nigerian government is the common enemy. So be it the Muslims, the Christians, populace, citizens in Nigeria are victims. But what's happened is Nigeria has not been able to develop a class system where you have people that is a class, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their religion. So, but the Nigerian elites have been able, from different tribes or religion, different stripes, they've been able to manipulate all of these identities for their own stuff. So I would say the truth is the Nigerian government has failed the citizens and continues to fail them. And in that regard, we can say yes, the Nigerian state can be complicit. The Nigerian states can be, we can hold them accountable in that regard. But to say that there is a deliberate attack, I don't think that is disingenuous to me to some extent, and it's suspicious. We need to question that. We need to really condemn it, because it could help to further polarize the situation in Nigeria and lead to more crisis. So if we come to the last question, look at how the Nigerian state has responded. In my opinion, to conclude, I would say the Nigerian state, if there's supposed to be an international pressure, it should be on the Nigerian state. It should be stopping the Nigerian elites from. So I think the national community is also complicit in how they would have indirectly, inadvertently support that in terms of whether they bring in resources over there. So they could target individuals and put pressure on the Nigerian state to provide governance to all of its citizens, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their color. So I'll just stop here and just wait for when we have questions to be able to talk for want of time. Thank you, Nika.
Thank you. And now to discuss the human rights aspect and civilian protection implication, Ikechukwu, if you could drive us through what we're seeing here and what potentially we could see.
Right. No, thank you so much. And just want to make sure. Okay, yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Levine and Dr. Wampa. I believe that just like Dr. Wampa said, this is a very complex situation, right? And it's one that has to be treated with the delicacy that it requires. Now I can't see. Okay, sorry, I couldn't see myself. Now, like Dr. Wampa laid out, there are multiple crises happening at the same time. There definitely is the jihadist movements and the killings in the north, but there are also myriads of criminal activity occurring all over the country. And so this characterization of the killing of Christians in the north of Nigeria, for example, is a manifestation of what I'll call the chronic malaise of the failure of governance in Nigeria, whether it is in relation to the management of the economy as it is in relation to the management of security or the administration of criminal justice. Now, there also is a definitional challenge here, because you realize, as has been stated clearly, that these attacks don't only happen or attacks against religious sites like churches or mosques. These attacks also happen in markets in just public places. where you may not be able to determine who is Christian or who is Muslim, right? So when there are attacks on a mosque, it would definitely be, or at least be, understood as an attack on Muslims. When there are attacks on churches, it will be defined as an attack on Christians, right? But for the most part, you realize that in terms of distinguishing who is killed, you have a challenge in terms of clear definitions, which goes back to the underlying challenge of documentation, underlying challenge of taking the time to understand from the government's perspective, Nigerian government's perspective, what actually is going on and what the responses should be. That failure of clearly and systematically understanding what the challenges are and resolving them has led to a vacuum that is filled by persuasions. And these persuasions can come from one place to the other. We're talking about the human rights implication. If you spoke to a Nigerian Christian living in the north of Nigeria, and you asked them a question of what they thought or what they think about President Trump's declaration, you may get one answer that will be different from some other person living somewhere else. When the Nigerian government has spoken about this, they've made reference to the provisions of the Constitution. They've made reference to the fact that there's freedom of religion, there's no state religion and stuff like that. They've avoided responding to the narrow issue of why are people being killed and why are there no institutions that can respond to such wanton killings in the country. So what manifests is a failure of government to respond. Now, the other issue is also some of the optics. You have an election concluded in 2023 where many Nigerians, mostly actually in the South, took issue with the fact that there were 2 Muslims on the ticket. That is an optic issue. Of course, the president has tried to dial that back to say, I'm married to a pastor, I'm married to a Christian, just like Dr. Wapa explained. However, you also had that succeeding a government where people believed that the previous president was a patron of an organization that advanced cattle rearing all across Nigeria, which has brought a lot of the cattle, the header farmer crisis that has moved down from the middle belt of Nigeria further down south today. Right? Now, it's also important to remember the fact that most Nigerians blame the Obama administration of supporting the then APC candidate who became president, which is General Muhammadu Buhari, who led for 8 years before this happened. So there is an optics problem. And every time the US has tried to engage in this issue, whether it was a Democratic government led by Barack Obama or even in the first iteration of the Trump administration, it has not necessarily solved the problem. The solution to this problem doesn't lie in Washington. The solution to this problem lies in Abuja, lies in Nigeria, lies in leadership. Now, one approach has been to provide ammunition, to provide support in terms of military hardware for the Nigerian government and the Nigerian military. Under the Obama administration, they made a decision to withhold military hardware to the Jonathan administration initially. And that, including the 2014 abduction of the Chibok girls, for which the Nigerian government had no response, railroaded that administration and led to a new administration, right? The former president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, on his trip to the US, was said to have had a conversation with President Trump about this issue and he promised that it was being addressed. And this was sometime after the last designation of as a country of particular concern. And now this is yet another engagement of the US government. So there's been a historical failure of governments to engage in this issue and to address it as Nigerians would love for it to be addressed. So it's really complex. There's the Almajiri issue going on in Nigeria, where you have almost 9.5 million kids, mostly in the north, who don't have access to education and who really have been radicalized and have found themselves engaged in some of this criminal activity. Now, the point I'm making is that this has to be addressed as criminal activity for which anyone involved must face the law. So institutions must be propped up by the government and allowed to operate independently. The Nigerian judiciary has never suffered as much trust deficit as it has today. That people don't believe you get justice when you go to the courts. That is a problem. So we have a governance challenge. However, with the supply of military hardware from the US, we have seen multiple, incidents described as target errors that has led to the killing of civilians. Again, understanding that these challenges are, you have terrorism happening in fashion that it does not distinguish who the terrorist is. It's asymmetrical warfare. These terrorists live within communities. And so bullets don't solve these issues. Bombs don't solve these issues. Violence does not solve this issue. We will get to talking about solutions, but anyone who is sincerely concerned, and now let me state very clearly that Nigerian Christians, especially those in the north, deserve global solidarity for what they have suffered. That we need to make that clearly. But anyone who wishes to solidarity must understand the complexity of this issue and be humble enough to operate within the landmines, because they are landmines. So, for example, you going into a context where you have splinter groups of Boko Haram who also have earmarked parts of the territory and are operating it in ways that it doesn't seem like the government fully even comprehends or understands. You're going into contexts where the economic downturn in the country creates a context where people are susceptible to criminal activity. So there's more to it than just a designation and a desire, to come in guns a-blazing. Right. Now, the potential impact of military engagement in this context exacerbates the underlying challenges and does not solve them. So the only way to address this in a way that it is beneficial to anyone, no matter who you are, is to identify these underlying challenges and resolve them, which is why as Dr. Levin said, they pull back on understanding, at least documenting these challenges, including in relation to the respect for civic space, electoral malpractices, and every other thing that causes disenchantment in the population and leads to and contributes to the underlying challenges would need to be addressed. You address this by propping up institutions and not by bombs and bullets. So I'll pause here and then we will continue when we have questions.
Thank you so much for that. It's very important that we have this discussion and that we don't reduce this story to a single story. So we are now going to open the floor for questions. We have already received some questions via emails, and so I'm going to share some of these with you, and then speakers, whoever feels comfortable to answer, please go ahead and take.
Nick, I think Carl is muted. Do you want to do the process again? So
Yes, let me see where Carl went.
it's just muted. That's just what you just unmute him. So. His video is on, but oh yeah, he's there. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Great, great. So one of the first questions that we have is, how does the CPC designation intersect with Nigeria's broader governance challenges, corruption, weak institution, and security sector accountability?
I think that's directed at me. So
anyone who wants to take it and feels comfortable answering.
Yeah, so I think I'll start. You know, globally, a lot of financial crimes are transnational. And this is something that has been widely appreciated ever since the first Ghana Must Go bag left Lagos for London. And things have gotten much, much more sophisticated with the emergence of easy wire transfers over the years and now cryptocurrency. And so if there is a mandated response to change, to direct changes with regard to financial controls or some sort of financial sanctions or the suspension of visas or the downgrading of diplomatic interactions, all of that interferes with counter-corruption activities and just the overall level of cooperation, including on security. Now, I do not think Trump will suspend weapons sales to Nigeria, and the reason is simple. Weapons sales are good for American jobs. And that's been pretty apparent with his approach to defense spending early on, and he's been pretty open about commenting along those lines. So I think, you know, on governance, on security cooperation, I think, you know, there's definitely a risk here, a problem. Trump has not used sanctions a lot under his government, but he has used other elements of economic statecraft, most notably tariffs. And so the kinds of sanctions that we're talking about under CPC, I would say, are certainly consistent with tariffs. And, you know, one of the things that I think is really sad, and I think we should all be concerned about, is that, you know, by pulling back from a deeper and mutually respectful engagement with Nigeria, the United States is essentially alienating one of its best allies in Africa, and a voice that's been really important for peace and conflict resolution in the region, has committed to peacekeeping operations, and has really been a sincere, if sometimes weak partner in the fight against extremism.
Yeah, let me add a bit to it. I can't cover it, but let me add a bit to that. If I understand the question very well, or if I interpret it this way, that what implication does the designation and Trump's whatever has on Nigeria? I think we can look at it in a negative as positive as well. So on the positive side, it could stimulate or motivate the state, the sleeping Nigerian state, to do what it's meant to do. Or just that threat alone, we've seen how the Nigerian state has always been very, very silent in dealing with issues on ground. You know, people die, thousands, hundreds are being killed a day. So it could make them act right. But on the con side of it, it could also create tension where the Muslims can feel targeted and then we can look at it, looking at external issues happening the inconsistency in Trump's, whether be it in the case of Israel, and then you look at how the Muslims are being targeted, and it can really create more division. So we can look at it from that angle. It could be positive or negative, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, you know, the threat of military intervention in Nigeria is contrary to the rules-based order we have under international law. The word that has been bandied about, and Dr. Wamba talked about it briefly, is genocide. Genocide is not a buzzword. It's a legal determination. And it's not one that is determined within, it's not one determined by the White House. It's one that will be determined by the appropriate fora, right? And so the impact of the CPC designation without the guns are blazing component, should be what we should be dealing with here, because that tweet was CPC and more, right? The guns are blazing component should not be part of the CPC designation. So in conflating it, there is an underlying legal challenge, legal issue. Genocide is the prohibition of genocide is customary international law, which means that it evokes an obligation to the international community as a whole. But it still does not, it's not an exception to the prohibition against the use of force and the prohibition against interference in country. So one thing that we should be taking out here, and policy folks should take out here, is that the reference to use of force and violence and military intervention for the purposes of this issue should be erased completely. That is not where we need to go. There are, like Dr. Levin has laid out, other levels of leverage and pressure that should be put on Nigeria that would may be useful in getting the Nigerian state to live up to its responsibilities. We don't want to go as far as any form of military engagement or the threat thereof.
Thank you, Gechukwu. I'm gonna check some of the questions here on the chat. Has there been polling on how Nigerian Christians living in Nigeria feel about Trump's statements and threat of weaponizing the military against Muslim terrorist groups? And then I'm gonna also read the other one so that we can kind of push through it. How is the Trump-Tinubu relationship, and how does that impact the influence that the US has on security in Nigeria? And then the last.
Can you rephrase that second question?
How is Trump-Tinubu's relationship, and how does that impact the influence that the US has on security in Nigeria? And lastly, how can, for those who are here in the diaspora, what are ways that we can express international solidarity? What are the ways that we can uplift this issue?
Okay. Let me just go first briefly, and then so on the polling of Christians, none that I know of, but all I can say is following up on what Kyle said earlier on. So we've seen, like everything, Nigerians have had positive or warm view. Well, Nigerian Christians have a warm view of Trump's, basically Trump presenting itself as the defender of the Christian faith. And then Nigerians have always, for some strange reason to me, ignored Trump's human rights stuff to do that. So then again, Carl mentioned the Igbos, who themselves are legitimately so, being faced injustice and marginalized. So they see this as a friend, an enemy of my enemy being my enemy. So we can look at it from that dynamics as well. And the government as well has tried to manipulate that narrative as well to see whether the Trump's designation and threat is due to the lobbying of this particular set of people. So I don't know if there's an actual polling, but from social medias and stuff, that has been what I've seen. But in terms of Trump-Tinubu relationship, funny enough, we've seen that the Nigerian government has remained defiant to some of Trump's what I call outrageous, maybe whether it be tariff, whether it be demand to take migrants. The Nigerian government have stayed strong against that, which I think is a thing of strength. So I would say Nigeria is very complex. Nigeria, like Carl mentioned, the relationship between Nigeria and the US, but Nigeria also is very, despite its negative sense, Nigeria has that, I would call it the ego, or there's a big brother kind of stuff to stand for itself. So I don't see the United States dealing with Nigeria as any smaller African state. So Nigeria is a very good partner in terms of security, in terms of other things. So I think beyond all of these public, so the United States would recognize that and recognize that Nigeria is not just a small country to just push around. The last question talk about what the diaspora can do. I don't know. The diaspora has always been influential, and I think the diaspora has played a role in Trump's government's designation through lobbying and stuff. So the same way the diaspora can also, and some of them have not always been, well, I say not always been honest. They've always conflated maybe narrow gains and then capitalize on the bigger stuff to just project their stuff. So the diaspora has always been very, very important, but it can be used as a force of good or force for evil.
Can I jump in? So, interestingly, the support for Donald Trump is higher in Nigeria than any other country in the world. Now, that survey was taken early this summer, and so it's possible that may change when those questions are asked next year. As Nigerians, will no longer have access perhaps to the same level of HIV support. And as the victims of Boko Haram no longer receive hundreds of millions of dollars of humanitarian assistance from USAID, now that USAID has been illegally dismantled. So that's, one part of, I think, that answer to the polls. And I think that also then speaks to the work to be done and where that work needs to be done. I think the solution to the violence, as Dr. Nwankpa and Uzoma have pointed out, is really needs to come from Abuja and from regional partners. But the CPC designation is coming from Washington. And that argument, that fight, that correction needs to take place here in Washington. And all three of us, I think, would agree on the complexities on the causes of the violence. And indeed, the African Union statement last night said precisely that, quote, any narrative that weaponizes religion or oversimplifies security challenges effectively impedes solutions and impedes effective security partnerships. So, we're all in agreement with the African Union on that. But I really think that the CPC designation is going to be problematic for diplomacy, for business, and for security.
Perfect. Unfortunately, we do not have time for more questions. I would have loved to ask one of my own regarding the role of the Nigerian diaspora here, but I'm still going to say a couple of things, and at the risk of being over time. As folks that live here in the United States, those who are able to should be able to at least either make a phone call to your members of Congress or write a letter. There are enough Nigerian Americans to have maybe not a cohesive response, but a response nevertheless. Because when we're silent, we're complicit in every decision that is being made without our participation. And so I want to urge folks that are here on this call to really think about their power as they live here in the United States. And it doesn't have to be a big effort, but even something as writing an op-ed, or really, I think the priority would be picking up the phone, texting your members of Congress or emailing them and letting them know that this is serious. And as Nigerians and Nigerian Americans, we are very concerned. I want to give 3 takeaways from today's discussion. Nigeria's crisis is multi-layered and not a single story religious conflict, and we must be able to discuss these things in a proper way, even though there's lots of layers of complexity. This designation, country of particular concern, carries diplomatic risks, but also opportunities here to have honest dialogue. And there is space, there is opportunity for responsible, constructive US-Nigeria engagement. And it has to be centered on governance, civilian protection, accountability, and non-escalation. So having said all this, I want to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Wankpa, Dr. Carlevan, Ikechukwu Uzama. Thank you so much for answering the call on such short notice. And please stay connected as we prepare to have these briefings and explain what's going on. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@ashastrategies.com. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.